Chapter 2. No one noticed that he was different, not like other children. His Aunt Julia would later report some scary episodes with knives, but otherwise he looked and acted like other children. He believed in Santa Claus, hated vegetables, and sometimes imagined ogres and scaly things crouching in his closet, waiting for night to fall. But he was haunted by something else, a fear, a doubt, sometimes only a vague uneasiness, that inhabited his mind with the subtlety of a cat. He felt it for years and years, but he didn't recognize it for what it was until much later. By then, this flaw, the rip in his psyche, had become the locus of a cold, homicidal rage. He was born to a prim, modest department store clerk, the eldest of 3 daughters, in the family of a Philadelphia nurseryman. Her story had always been that in 1946, fresh out of high school, she was seduced by Jack Worthington, a rakish veteran of the recent war who hinted to her of an old money pedigree. At least that's what she claimed. Much later, family members would express open doubts about this story, directing a defense psychiatrist's attention to Louise's violent, possibly deranged father, Samuel Cowell. Whatever the truth, Louise was pregnant in an era not congenial to single young women in such a predicament, nor was she insulated from her problem by family means. She braved her way through the first 7 months of her term before traveling north to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. On November 24, 1946, she gave birth to her love child. Louise called him Theodore. She'd always liked that name. Just before his 4th birthday, Teddy and his mother left Philadelphia to join her uncle and his family in Tacoma, Washington. Ted told us that the move upset him, either as a deliberate falsehood or due to some trick of memory. He described his early days in Philadelphia as an idyll, saying he loved his grandfather Cowell and the comfortable old house where his family all lived together. He said he didn't understand why he and Louise had to go live with Great Uncle Jack, why Louise needed to get away, to start a new life. In light of what the family would later disclose, Ted's recall becomes a mystery in itself. He hated Tacoma at first. After Philadelphia, the Puget Sound mill town seemed raw and impermanent to him, just a jumble of ugly brown and gray buildings on a hillside jutting out into the frigid saltwater of Puget Sound. Ted would outgrow his initial distaste for his new home, but he would never get over an arrogant disdain for anything he regarded as common. This attitude was linked to how he felt about himself, his deep self-doubt, and also to his later conviction that life had wronged him. Jack Cowell was only a few years older than his niece, Louise, and Teddy always called him Uncle. A music professor at Tacoma's College of Puget Sound, Uncle Jack was a man of both accomplishment and refinement. His gleaming dark piano, the classical music that filled the house, his air of cultivation drew Teddy to him. Early on, he decided to pattern himself on Uncle Jack. Louise went to work as a secretary at the Council of Churches office in downtown Tacoma. There she was, befriended by a female co-worker who coaxed the tentative newcomer into attending young adult nights at the First Methodist Church. One evening, Louise was introduced to John Culpeper Bundy, known as Johnny, a soft-spoken native North Carolinian who recently had mustered out of the Navy in nearby Bremerton. Johnny's drawl made him seem a little slow, a serious drawback as far as Teddy would be concerned. He was unlettered, and his prospects in life were those of a modest southern country boy. With his Navy hitched over, Johnny had decided to stay in the Northwest. He found a job as a cook in a Veterans Administration hospital a few miles south of Tacoma. It turned out to be his life's work. From the start, Johnny and Louise saw something special in each other. Johnny was steady and uncomplicated, and he filled Louise's first and ultimate requirement by accepting both her and her son. She was also drawn to his mild disposition, although her son Teddy would later learn the consequences of provoking his quiet stepfather. For Johnny, Louise was a gentle, God-fearing woman whose history began on the night they met. He didn't ask questions, and Louise did not go into details. From what Ted told us of his boyhood, he He seems to have tried to block Johnny, the interloper, from his mind. Clearly, Johnny's presence upset him. Ted remembers staging a scene in a Sears store parking lot and wetting his pants. He conceded that this tantrum and others probably were a result of his jealousy over Louise and his fear that Johnny's advent would further disrupt his world. Louise miscarried the summer following her May 1951 marriage to Johnny. Then a daughter, Linda, was born in the last part of 1952. Here was another confusing mystery for Teddy. He didn't know where babies came from or how they were made, but he knew it had something to do with Johnny, and he believed throughout his entire life that Louise suffered a good deal at Linda's birth. According to his mother, however, the pregnancy was uneventful. Ted also told us that it was around this time that his parents broke him of the habit of crawling into bed with them when he grew frightened in the middle of the night. The earliest evidence of Ted's behavior outside the family comes from his first grade teacher, Mrs. Oyster. According to Louise, Teddy was very fond of Mrs. Oyster. On his report card, the teacher wrote Louise that Teddy grasped the numbers 1 through 20, knew the meaning of 100, was at ease before the class, and expressed himself well. Ted told us he was quote-unquote unsettled when Mrs. Oyster left to have a baby and was replaced by a substitute teacher. However much this affected him, he was definitely upset by his second grade teacher, who he described as a doctrinaire Catholic named Miss Jerry. She was about 5 feet tall, Ted recalled, with the shape and menacing attitude of a cannonball about ready to explode. Teddy Bundy, a Protestant, felt Miss Jerry discriminated against him, and he vividly recollected the day she broke a ruler over his knuckles for having socked a classmate in the nose during a playground scuffle. Ted was about 7 or 8 at this point, a not unusual child from all appearances, and so far only minimally affected by his flaw, the presence of which he could only sense through the uneasiness he often felt. He sometimes escaped into fantasy, particularly the Roy Rogers and Dale Evans adoption fantasy, a key feature of which was having his own pony and everything else he wanted. His first gesture of defiance was passive, occasioned by the arrival of a black family on the previous all-white block where the Bundys lived. There were fears that property values would be hurt. Teddy knew that Johnny was particularly concerned, so he went out of his way to make friends with one of the black children, he told me. That house, Bundy recalled, was a warm, friendly place, fairly bursting with clouds of pungent odors emerging from the kitchen, smells that never came from my parents' house and that I just found terribly exotic. End quote. At times, Ted felt deprived. He was jealous of his cousin John, Uncle Jack's boy, and contemptuous of his own family's modest station in life. Ted told me he was mortified by the sensible ramblers Johnny drove, so much so that he recalled being, quote-unquote, humiliated to be seen in them. Likewise, from the time he could first walk and talk, little Teddy always pulled his mother to the most expensive racks and clothing stores. The preoccupation with material possessions would stay with the boy and intensify. Even though little Teddy was deeply materialistic, he wanted possessions. With the birth of another child, brother, Glenn, in February of 1954, the Bundys had outgrown their second house. The following summer, they moved to a roomier tract house that would be large enough to accommodate the present family, plus the final 2 arrivals, another daughter, Sandra, in 1956, and a son, Richard, in 1961. Teddy found this new neighborhood decidedly unappealing. A tract had been thrown up with little regard to aesthetics. It looked to Teddy as if every bit of vegetation had been scraped away, leaving ragged clumps of Scotch broom to invade where graceful firs once had towered above. He became close friends with 2 boys in his new neighborhood, and they would continue to be his nearest pals all the way through high school. One was a gregarious kid named Terry Storwick. The other friend was a roly-poly youngster named Warren Dodge. Terry and Warren both found Teddy to be great company, even if he was a little aloof at times. Brittle, even. There was also the manner of Teddy's temper. Behind his house in the field of Scotch broom, the boys played guerrilla war games, using as weapons spear ferns, which leapt off a foot or so above the ground, made perfect missiles to fling at one another. One afternoon, in the heat of combat, Warren caught Teddy just below the eye with the cloudy, fibrous root that formed the nose of the fern missile. In an instant, Teddy was on top of Warren, his fist cocked. Terry and the other boys pulled him off. The incident stayed with Terry Storwick not because the show of anger was so unusual for an overexcited kid, but because the child was Teddy Bundy. Quote, Ted kept himself separate from situations, Terry told me, so it was something to see him get involved. When he got hit in the eye, he definitely got involved, end quote. Ted's short fuse got him into other boyhood scrapes, too. At Boy Scout camp, he shoved a plate in another scout face for having hatcheted a small tree. On another scout outing, he tangled with a kid named John Moon. Bundy hit him over the head with a stick, Terry Storwick remembered. It was a very deliberate attack on another person. The way John Moon described it, he was attacked from behind. Storwick continued, it was real easy to see when Ted got mad. His eyes turned just about black. I suppose that sounds like something out of a cheap novel, but you could see it. He had blue eyes that were kind of flecked with darker colors. When he got hot, they seemed to get less blue and darker. It didn't have to be a physical affront either. Someone would say something and you could just see it in his face. The dark flecks seemed to expand. Like most mothers, it was Louise, not Johnny, who took the direct hand in raising the Bundy family. Quote, we didn't talk a lot about real personal matters, said Ted, certainly never about sex or any of those things. My mom has trouble talking on intimate personal terms. There's this logjam of feeling in her that she doesn't open up and explain. We never spoke about her childhood, aside from the fact that she grew up in my grandfather's house with my aunts and my grandma, and that she was extremely successful in high school, the head of everything. I read her yearbook. She was president of this and president of that. Terribly popular person. Her big disappointment was that she had had 1 B in 3 years of high school. End quote. Ted reflected for a minute, concentrating hard on this issue. Then, I don't know, he went on at last. Something intervened. I can remember her having some resentment that there was only one scholarship offered in her school, and the richest girl got it. Of course, my mom didn't have any money to go to school, and she didn't think it was very equitable that the other girl who had straight A's got the scholarship. Even years and years later, I detected a strong sorrow in her voice when she told me about it. End quote. Ted described his own youth as solitary. One of his favorite boyhood pastimes was listening to late-night talk radio. Alone in the dark of his room, he would pretend he was part of a special and secret world. I'd really get into it, he told me. As people would be calling in and speaking their minds, I'd be formulating questions as if they were talking to me. It gave me a great deal of comfort to listen to them, and often it didn't make a hell of a lot of difference what they were talking about. Here were people talking, and I was eavesdropping on their conversations. As Bundy matured physically, he developed into a well-coordinated athlete and a handsome young man. Yet the mental maturity was not there and never would come. Ted was extremely self-conscious. He considered himself too skinny to compete with the bigger boys. Well, I attempted to get on the school basketball team and a couple of baseball teams, and I failed, he said. It was terribly traumatic for me. I just didn't know what to do. I thought it was something personal. End quote. He turned to solitary sports, Terry Storwick remembered. Ted really took to skiing. He found the money somehow to buy good equipment. He was pretty serious about it. He considered himself a pretty good skier. End quote. Bundy's costly ski gear was mostly stolen, a fact that would have shocked family friends who knew the eldest Bundy boy as a regular churchgoer with his parents, vice president of the Methodist Youth Fellowship, and a promising teenager interested in a career in law enforcement. They could not have imagined the Ted who, along with several other boys, devised a crude ski lift ticket forgery scheme that involved the careful bleaching and dyeing of the color-coded passes. They were never caught. Far more ominous, however, was the bitterness and hostility, also unsuspected, seething inside him. One day, as Ted explained to me, he was rummaging through some of his parents' papers where he found his birth certificate. Unknown was typed in under father's name. According to an enigmatic letter he later sent us, quote, "It was not an agonizing occasion. I saw it more as an opportunity to make a decision about who I was," end quote. Bundy never elaborated on what that decision was. He wrote that he took a long walk and came home reconciled to this new knowledge. Quote, "It may have gone something like this. I am who I am, and what I am I owe to my mom, dad, granddad, and others who raised me," end quote. Then in parentheses, "Not necessarily profound, but not a bad beginning for a young kid," close parentheses. Why be concerned about someone I never knew? My mom loved me enough to give birth to me, care for me, and love me. This seemed to be more than enough. However, Bundy's one-time fiancée, Liz Kendall, a pseudonym, reported the discovery a little differently. Ted's cousin John taunted him about his illegitimacy, Kendall recounted in her book Phantom Prince. According to her, Bundy at first angrily refused to believe his cousin and would not believe him until John produced the birth certificate himself. Kendall wrote that Bundy was furious with his mother for causing him such humiliation. Terry Storwick's unclouded recollections probably are as reliable as any. He is the first person with whom Ted shared his knowledge. Quote, "Ted never told me how he discovered he was illegitimate," Storwick recollected. We were in high school and were down at my parents' beach place talking about some personal subject. It might have had to do with how he was arguing with his dad. He just said, "Of course, you know it's not my real father." It was a bell ringer. A lot of things fell into place for me right then and there. I said, "Well, why is your name Bundy?" He went on to tell me that he'd been born in Philadelphia. Very vague stuff. The rat didn't marry his mother and such. I think he was wondering how I was going to think about him. It seemed to me that this was kind of like being adopted or something. So I said, "There are people who love you now." I think I said I thought it was no big deal. But he said something to the effect that for him it made a big difference. This was important to him. It wasn't just something to be swept under the rug. When I made light of his situation, he said, "Well, it's not you that's a bastard." He was bitter when he said it. Following discovery of his illegitimacy, Ted's attitude toward Johnny hardened into outright defiance. Quote, "Ted's mother loved him very much," Terry Storwick told us. "I'm sure that she protected him from Johnny's temper. It wasn't that Johnny was an unreasonable man. I think his temper was a reaction to Ted's animosity." Close parentheses. The schism between man and boy was expressed in Ted's sudden refusal to call Johnny Dad after having done so for years. He began calling Johnny Father, and then finally John. "You know, Ted was way ahead of Johnny when it came to intellectual things," said Storwick. "He could just talk him into holes in the ground, leave him no way out but to use his body. Johnny is a man of few and simple words, and Ted was his match by the time he was in the 6th grade. A couple of times I thought his dad was going to kill him. The anger was there, you know. Back then, quote, "Back then, John Bundy was a wiry little sucker, well-muscled. I remember one particular occasion at their lake place. He was cutting wood or something. Ted was. I guess showing off for me, smart-assing. John took a swing at him. If he would have connected, he would have laid Ted flat on his ass. He had a temper as quick as Ted's." The first sign of serious problems in Ted's inner world was a sudden and complete halt to his social development. It was a quiet crisis, easily missed by others, but acutely perplexing and painful to him. In junior high school, everything was fine. He told me nothing that I can recall happened that summer before my sophomore year to stunt me or otherwise hinder my progress. But I got to high school and I didn't make any progress. He sounded genuinely perplexed. How can I say it? I'm at a loss to describe it even now. Maybe I didn't have the role models at home that could have aided me in school. I don't know. But I felt alienated from my old friends. They just seemed to move on, and I didn't. I don't know why, and I don't know if there's an explanation. Maybe it's something that was programmed by some kind of genetic thing in my early schooling. It seemed like there was no problem in learning what the appropriate social behaviors were. It just seemed like I hit a wall in high school. End quote. I asked Bundy if he took these issues to his mother or a counselor to discuss them. It never crossed my mind, he answered. I didn't think anything was wrong, necessarily. I wasn't sure what was wrong and what was right. All I knew was that I felt a bit different. For Terry Storwick, his friend's social withdrawal was all the more mysterious for the fact that Ted was so bright and amusing. Quote, he was a lampooner. He had the darts, Storwick said. Seemed wonderfully subtle. He could make me laugh with a gesture or one or two words where I need sentences and pictures and diagrams to get the same thing across. I took this to be a token of his intelligence. He didn't have the confidence, however, to follow it up. He could have been a really strong influence on a lot of people if he had had the self-confidence to go along with the intellect. It seemed to me that he was just tongue-tied in social situations. It didn't have to be girls. Meeting new friends, meeting new people from another school was a difficult thing for him to do, end quote. Decades later, Storwick could see in his mind's eye Ted, quote, walking down the hall with that half-aggressive, half-hopeful expression. I'm sure he was slighted a lot, at least in my circle of friends. It was important to be popular. We'd be standing in the hallway and someone would come up to me and say, hey, we're going to have a party Friday. Can you come over? Ted would be standing there and he wouldn't be asked. It wasn't that he was singled out for ridicule, but you have to remember that Ted was a very sensitive person. Very sensitive, end quote. Ted Bundy had but a single date throughout his 3 years at Woodrow Wilson High School in Tacoma. He told me that he would have liked to go out more, but he never could tell if a girl liked him, so he assumed she did not. I am particularly dense or insensitive, not knowing when a woman's interested in me, he explained. I've been described as handsome and all this shit, or attractive. I don't believe it. It's a built-in insecurity. I don't believe I'm attractive, end quote. Sex baffled him. When his buddies talked about girls and what they were doing with them, or wished they were doing with them, or lied about what they were doing with them, Ted listened without comprehension. He told me, I had trouble grasping any of it. It kind of went over my head. He felt at ease in only 2 environments, the ski slopes and the classroom. I spoke up in class, he explained. It's a formalized setting and the ground rules are fairly strict. Your performance is measured by different rules than what happens when everybody's peeling off into little cliques down the hallway, end quote. Because he was articulate and cultivated an image of serious-mindedness to hide his loneliness, Bundy was regarded as scholarly by the other students at Wilson. Yet, for all his seeming seriousness of purpose, his grades were only good, not great. He left high school with just above a B average, good enough to earn Ted admission to Uncle Jack's school, parentheses, by then renamed the University of Puget Sound, close parentheses, together with a small scholarship. Outwardly, conditions seemed ideal for this bright, attractive young man to step forward into the world, to overcome his shyness and to seize this opportunity. What do I feel like in this chapter, like Machado Ainsworth noted that they grew up like close to each other and that one of them something about being like the difference was something about him being born in wedlock or something. Maybe it's in another chapter later on, but anyway, an upside note. Few people at Wilson High School would have been surprised to hear that he eventually went on to law school and became a rising star in the local Republican firmament. The closer people felt to Ted, the surer that likelihood seemed. Yet the next thing that many of his boyhood acquaintances would know of the diffident boy with the half-hopeful expression was that police suspected him of a string of hideous murders. They'd sort back through their memories, trying to recall something odd or different about him, something identifiable in his past that would help explain this tragedy. They couldn't. Not even Bundy's closest friend, Terry Storwick, can connect the Ted he knew with what Ted became. As we spoke, Terry's eyes teared up at times with the pain of memory. Aloof though Ted was, the 2 boys felt a bond, even a debt on Terry's part. Ted once saved Terry's niece Wendy from drowning. Quote, there is no way, Storwick said, his voice breaking, that the person I grew up with could have done the things they said he did, and there's no way for me to reconcile the image of the mass murderer and the kid who came running to my back porch when the first snow fell in November, all excited to go skiing. In between those two images, something happened. Definitely something popped. Ted's critical challenge from his teen years onward was the perfection and maintenance of a credible public persona, his mask of sanity. Lacking true adult emotions, he had to put on the look of normalcy while inside him the tumult raged unabated. He underwent a process of mock acculturation, like an alien life form acquiring appropriate behavior through mimicry and artifice. It was painful and confusing to him, each frequent misstep a stab at the child bewildered by his inability to handle the simplest adult relationships. Quote, I didn't know what made things tick, Ted told me. I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what made people attractive to one another. I didn't know what underlay social interactions, end quote. His happiest moment during the first year of college came when he bought a '58 Volkswagen Bug for $400. The little car meant freedom to Ted. He could get in it and drive and be alone whenever he wanted, a reprise of his early boyhood when he and his collie Lassie would disappear out into the trees for hours. Ted loved Volkswagens. He would own two in his life. The second one, a light brown '68, eventually would yield evidence of his secret life. Ted lived at home for his freshman year. Quote, he got along fine as far as I could tell, his mother remembered. He got good grades that first year, end quote. Louise was not alarmed that her son, quote, never got into the social life of the school at all. He'd come home, study, sleep, and go back to school, end quote. By Ted's account, quote, my social life was a big zero. I spent a great deal of time with myself. It was a lonely year for me, and it was worse because I didn't have my old neighborhood buddies around, end quote. He declined to join a fraternity and can still recall how cowed he felt in the presence of self-assured, hardy fraternity brothers. Although he was rushed, he wouldn't join because, quote, I didn't feel socially adept enough. I didn't feel I knew how to function with those people. I felt terribly uncomfortable, end quote. Ted only spoke when spoken to, or in class. He made no new friends. For all intents, he was an invisible man that year. Instinctively, Bundy turned to the classroom as his stage for building an identity. He had found in high school how easy it was to appear scholarly. The ability and willingness to speak up often were enough to set him apart. But freshman survey courses taken in large impersonal lecture halls offered scant opportunity to be anything but anonymous and small, the way Ted felt most of the time. He was very disappointed. Then one day he attended an international affairs lecture on mainland China and immediately was struck with the notion that here was an area where people might take notice of him without threatening him. He didn't think about how much work the subject might entail. Ted saw the Chinese language as exotic, glamorous, a bright cloak in which to wrap himself. The following autumn, he enrolled as a transfer student at the University of Washington's first-rate Asian Studies program in Seattle. As at UPS, he did not see himself measuring up to fraternity row, so Ted took a room in a dorm. But he was right about his new major. It did set him apart from the run of the undergraduate population at the huge university. He threw himself into the arcana of ideograms and earned high grades. He acquired a little restaurant Chinese, learned to use chopsticks, and actually made a few friends. He had made a start at fabricating the public Ted, scholarly, bright, witty, serious-minded, wholesome, and handsome. He developed an air of cool self-assurance, a look that women could not resist. Ted lured females the way a lifeless silk flower can dupe a honeybee. At least twice in his life, the beguilement would endure. With other females, like his first true girlfriend, the spell eventually shattered. Marjorie Russell, a pseudonym, was a co-ed at the University of Washington, a lissom beauty, nearly 6 feet tall. She was wealthy, poised, and worldly. Marjorie was from a class into which Ted previously had enjoyed only upward glimpses. Moreover, she knew what she wanted out of life. She was, in short, everything that Ted Bundy was not and wished to become. He showed her off like a possession to his old friends. Warren Dodge was impressed. I was kind of surprised that Ted had something like her with him, Dodge remembered. He soon took her home to meet his mother. She was very nice, said Louise. At that time, Ted was very serious about her. At 20 years of age, Bundy was no more sexually advanced than he'd been in high school, when the other boys' talk had gone over his head. Certainly any lust he felt toward Marjorie at this juncture was well hidden. They spent nights together, but he did not make any sexual advances. Ted was content to be boyish and charming, as if introducing carnality to the relationship would somehow taint it. The summer following his sophomore year he spent down amidst the gum trees and palms and tiled roofs of Stanford University, where he was enrolled in an intensive Chinese language program. He had gone to Stanford mainly to please and impress Marjorie, but it was a mistake. He was accustomed to being alone, but he was not ready to be alone away from home. Ted missed familiar things. Quickly he fell behind the other students, and that made it all the harder for him to socialize with them. And there was Marjorie. I found myself thinking about standards of success that I just didn't seem to be living up to, he told me. At Stanford, Ted's immaturity was exposed, a particularly hateful experience for him because he had now failed in the one arena, the classroom, that had always been his refuge. Then Marjorie dropped him. As she later told investigators, what had been his winning boyishness now struck her as puerility. She wearied of his fawning attitude, and she was tired of his games. Ted would often sneak up behind her, tap her on her shoulder, and then vanish. That annoyed her. She advised him to grow up. Ted's brother Glenn recalled that Marjorie, quote, screwed him up for a while. He came home and seemed pretty upset and moody. Had never seen him like that before. He was always in charge of his emotions, end quote. Louise Bundy remembered something similar. Quote, as I understand it, she told him she couldn't wait around for Ted to have it made. If she found somebody else, she'd go that way. He was pretty hurt by that, end quote. Ted did not understand what had happened to him, why the mask he had been using had failed him. This first tentative foray into the sophisticated world had ended in disaster. It would usher in another period of isolation in which he would brood on his situation, keeping to himself until a better, more workable mask could be fashioned. The rest of 1967 was, as he remembered, quote, absolutely the pits for me, the lowest time ever, unquote. He gave up on Chinese altogether after having wasted a year in its study, for no better reason than Marjorie having once said that she admired the architect's role played by Albert Finney in the movie Two for the Road. Ted applied to the University of Washington's architectural program. The school was filled, so on the advice of a university counselor, he turned to urban planning, and failed at that too. That fall was all he could do to go to class. To concentrate on the material was out of the question. The professor's words meant nothing. His class notes were indecipherable. The university environment had turned hostile, frightening. He developed a phobic dread of encountering Marjorie on campus. By Christmas, he withdrew from school. He saved a little money, borrowed more, then took off on a flying trip around the country. Ted went to California, to Aspen, Colorado, and back to Philadelphia to visit his grandparents. Dogged by his feelings of worthlessness and failure, he came home to Seattle in the spring of 1968, still unable to face a return to school. He took a small apartment and went to work as a busboy in a hotel dining room, as well as a night stalker in a Safeway store. I absorbed all this uncertainty, Ted told me, and all the confusion about why I was doing what I was doing, wondering where I was going, all by myself. Because I'm not the kind of person who socialized a lot, there was no way to let off steam. Following his return to Seattle, he made a friend named Richard, a sometime thief and drug user whose life at the fringe of society fascinated Ted. At age 21, Ted hadn't been exposed to an outlaw element more sinister than the circle of ski lift ticket counterfeiters he knew in high school. Now he would encounter the possibility of illicit excitement on a higher plane. Stealing, especially shoplifting, came naturally to Ted. The unsocialized child within him wanted things, expensive, shiny things such as rich people owned, and Ted had no adult compunctions about acquiring them illegally. Moreover, theft was an adventure, a game, a kind of advanced variation on hide and seek, not unlike tapping people on the shoulder and then disappearing. One night, Ted and Richard sneaked down to a beach near Seattle where landslides had pulled down a cliffside house. They were after anything they could find. We went down there in the dead of night, Ted told me. The house was full of shit. I still have some luggage from there. It was really thrilling. Ted was not a thief in any ordinary sense. He didn't take money, but he wouldn't take merchandise for the purpose of selling it. The need was much closer to kleptomania, and it was overpowering. Yet he was never once caught for shoplifting anything, a remarkable fact in light of the number of thefts he made and the way he went about them. Even professional shoplifters, people schooled in the most refined techniques of their trade, customarily have long arrest records. His first principle was anonymity. Once he decided what he wanted, he would put on his good suit and comb his hair. He wanted to look presentable and forgettable. Then he downed 2 or 3 quick beers. I'd drink just to pump myself up, he told me. I felt I wouldn't have any inhibitions. I didn't want to be looking over my shoulder and appear nervous. That's important. He stole a television, a stereo, home furnishings, cookware, clothing, and artwork, things that he wanted to own, possessions. Typical of his expeditions was the day he decided he wanted a tree for his apartment. Quote, I walked into the side entrance of this place and went into their greenhouse, he said. I saw this Benjaminus tree and picked it up. This fucker was 8 feet tall, heavy, and a little bulky, but I just walked out the side gate, lifted the thing up, and threw the sunroof through the car. There was a good 5 feet of Benjaminus sticking out of the top as I drove away. I don't remember that part. Around the time he was burglaring the house on the beach, Ted bumped into an old acquaintance from high school. They talked for a bit on the street corner, then the friend casually mentioned that if Ted was interested, he might latch on in some capacity working for Art Fletcher, a black small-town city councilman who then was contending to become the Republican nominee for lieutenant governor. Several mutual acquaintances were already working for Fletcher. Ted Bundy jumped at the chance. I just pitched right in, he told me. Oh boy, here we go again. I hadn't had a social life for some time. It just felt good to belong again, to instantly be part of something. If Ted Bundy the thief inhabited one corner of his personality, then elsewhere there resided Ted Bundy the committed Republican. Ever since high school, when he had delivered a Rockefeller nomination speech at a mock GOP convention, Ted had been drawn to politics. In his senior year, he had joined the re-election effort of a local Republican congressman and had loved the experience. The reason I love politics and was because there was something that allowed me to use my talents and assertiveness, he said. You know, the guy who'd raise his hand in class and speak up, and the social life came with it. You were accepted. You went out to dinner with people, they invited you to dinner. I didn't have the money or the tennis club membership or whatever it takes to really have the inside track, so politics was perfect. You can move among the various strata of society. You can talk to people to whom otherwise you'd have no success. He immediately quit his jobs and went to work as a full-time Fletcher volunteer. Ted's finances were strained, but it was well worth it to him. It was a time when the bulk of committed, politically conscious young people were part of the peace movement. Ted Bundy, however, was foursquare for the establishment. He had no intention of aligning himself with the outsiders, the dispossessed, or the poor. That fall, Ted had the great good fortune to be named Art Fletcher's official driver. Had he remained in college, Ted would have been starting his junior year, but he had been so traumatized by Marjorie and his collapse in Chinese that he was still 2 years away from being able to successfully resume his studies. He was still a virgin, too, and might have remained so indefinitely if sex had required him to make the first move. However, one night while away from Seattle on campaign business, he drank himself into a near stupor at a GOP official's house in eastern Washington. When Ted drank, he often got drunk. That night he had to be taken to someone's home to sleep it off. As he remembers the night, he was installed in a downstairs bedroom, only semi-conscious. when the lady of the house gently crawled into bed beside him, stripped him of his clothes, and relieved him of his virginity. His role in the seduction was entirely passive. Politics is a seasonal business. After Art Fletcher ran a close second in the November election, his driver was thrown back on his own resources. During the campaign, Ted had watched how people get along and had acquired by rote some of the social skills he could not come by naturally. He had matured into a slim, even-featured young man with clear blue eyes and an ironic smile. He took meticulous care with his appearance and dressed with a casual, studied tweediness. The clothes he couldn't buy, he stole. All the elements of the mask were now coming together, forming a seamless facade. Bundy took a temporary sales job in a Seattle department store, one from which he had shoplifted and where he learned something new about himself. He had a knack for chatting up the women customers. He could sell them anything. He saved up some money, sold his '58 Volkswagen, and headed once again for Philadelphia. He hoped that he could start school again there in his grandfather's town, away from the physical reminders of his days with Marjorie. He spent the first half of 1969 at Temple University with mixed results. A special urban affairs project was never completed, but he did moderately well in theatrical arts classes. Ted learned a little something about acting and makeup. He also bought a false mustache. By now he had made yet another realization about himself. His face lacked any single characteristic that stood out above the rest. Like the personality he was creating, his face could be anything he wanted it to be. The mustache, combing his hair differently, gaining or losing a few pounds, growing a beard, all changed his appearance dramatically. He could, when he wished, be as anonymous as he wanted. He had, as one of his judges later observed, the face of a changeling, quote, unquote, end quote. Ted Bundy returned to Seattle in the summer of 1969 and took a room at Ernst and Frida Rogers' house, one of several university district rooming houses where single people, usually students, could find an inexpensive place to stay. The Rogers took an instant liking to him. Ted was polite. He kept his room clean and tidy. He was happy to run Mrs. Rogers to the store or to help Ernst with jobs around the house. He seemed like a gentle person to Frida. She would remember the time they had coffee together in her kitchen. An outsized fly began to buzz around them. Frida started to swat it, but Ted jumped up, exclaimed, "Don't kill it!" and chased the fly out the window. He lived around the corner from the Sandpiper Tavern, a college beer joint where he had some success in picking up girls. On the last night of September 1969, he walked into the Sandpiper and sat down at the bar. Across the crowded dance floor sat Elizabeth Kendall, 24, an appealing medical secretary and divorcee out for an evening of fun with a group of her friends. Ted finished a pitcher of beer at the bar before he found the courage to approach her. As he recalled the occasion, Ted walked over to her and asked for a dance. "I'm sorry," Liz replied, "I can't dance." On most nights that would have been enough to send Ted Bundy into a funk. Quote, "For my somewhat tentatively developed ego," he explained to me, "it was always a less than pleasant experience for someone to say that they didn't want to dance. I never got over that." End quote. Emboldened by his beer, however, Ted was brave enough to ask one of Liz's friends to dance. She said sure, and rose. Moments later on the dance floor, Ted noticed Liz now was dancing too. He flashed her a wolfish smile and said, "Well, you really can't dance, can you?" Liz found Ted very charming. According to her, he introduced himself as a law student and said he was working on a book about Vietnam. She didn't necessarily buy the business about the writing project, but Ted was so good-looking and smoothly confident that by the end of the evening she recalled, "I was already planning the wedding and naming the kids." She took Ted home with her that night. Both had drunk a good deal. They slept together clothed. In the morning, her daughter Joni, pseudonym, was up early demanding Pop-Tarts and chocolate. Ted was delighted by the little girl, but Liz made it clear that he should leave, and he did. But he couldn't get Liz out of his mind. She had struck a chord in Ted. He idealized her as he had Marjorie. There was also something about Liz, something he couldn't quite articulate, that made him feel he had known her all his life. The daughter of a successful Utah doctor, she had gone through an early and painful marriage that left her with a distinct distrust of men. She also had a jealous streak, exacerbated by insecurity and Ted's later philanderings. Knowing nothing of mature love and respect, he could only seem to be something or someone. For Liz, he had created the Ted Bundy who wrote books and went to law school. In truth, he was a dropout and working as a legal messenger when they met. Like a child, he couldn't foresee the consequences of his living out this fantasy, just as he could not see how his own babyish behavior had cost him Marjorie. It wasn't 3 months after he met Liz that they began to discuss marriage. They took out a license and talked to her relatives about using their home for the ceremony. When he could no longer sustain the charade, Ted stunned Liz by theatrically tearing up their marriage license on the pretext it was too soon and sudden for them to marry. A short while later, he confessed his true station in the world. Liz forgave him. Liz saw as much of Ted at this time as did anyone. They made love several nights a week, went on day excursions with Joni, visited his family, telephoned each other constantly. Yet, even she did not penetrate the mask. In love with Ted, dazzled by him, she rationalized away his lies, and appears to have handled his petty cruelties by responding in kind. When Ted hurt her by ignoring her, or made her jealous by seeing other women, she hurt him back. Liz dealt with Ted at his level. In retrospect, it seems improbable that a woman could be quite so utterly gulled, but she was not alone. His mother detected nothing, the stores from which he stole detected nothing, his Republican friends, the scores of campaign workers and elected officials, detected nothing. By now, there was more and more for Ted to keep hidden. From what he told us at the prison, it is certain that by this stage he had a strong appetite for violent pornography. He has conceded to police interrogators that he crept around the university district late at night. Sometimes he stole things from houses, sometimes he peeped into women's windows. Also developing within him were cyclical depressions. Quote, it wasn't dictated by the cycle of the moon or anything else, he told me, not mood swings, just changes. It's damn hard for me to describe it. All I wanted to do was just lay around, just consume huge volumes of time without doing a thing. Even in these periods, however, I'm capable of being genuinely cheerful and gregarious, at least for a limited amount of time. I became expert at projecting something very different, that I was very busy. I had a huge part of my life that nobody knew about. It didn't take much effort at all, end quote. Ted felt that, on the surface at least, Liz took the marriage license scene and his lies in stride. When he told her that he was still 2 years short of an undergraduate degree, she urged him to return to school. Liz gave him a couple $100 to cover tuition and helped launch him into yet another major, psychology. Ted could offer a number of reasons for choosing psychology, but he conceded to me that the decision, quote, was probably an outgrowth of my confusion about myself, end quote. He did feel good about the choice, and beginning with the University of Washington summer term of 1970, he tore into the subject with demonic intensity. Ted did not miss a single question on one final exam. He wrote a paper on schizophrenia that won high praise from his professor. Ted was driven. It was a marvelous feeling, he said, to have purpose and to do well at the same time. The periods of malaise abated for a time, but he couldn't stop his late-night patrols or his impulsive thievery. From May of 1970 until September of 1971, he drove a delivery truck for Pedline, a family-owned medical supply company. Once he stole a photograph from a doctor's office and was caught. His boss let him off with a stern lecture. The company didn't know until later that he had been stealing from them too. Among the things he took was a container of plastic casting material. Ted's next job was in a work-study program run by the Seattle Crisis Clinic. One night a week he took calls from the frantic, the lonely, and the suicidal. At least once a month there would be the high drama of a call from someone who had already taken a lethal dose or slit his or her wrists. Ted would keep the caller on the line long enough for the number to be traced, and there would be the tense minutes until he could hear the police breaking into the caller's home. The people he felt most sensitive to were women. Quote, I had the best results with women who were lonely and had been abandoned by their husbands or mates, Ted said. I felt they really hurt the most. They were reaching out because they were alone and really needed someone. End quote. Ted finally accumulated enough credits by the spring of 1972 to earn his degree in psychology. He had decided by then that he wanted to become a lawyer. His grades were good enough, but despite hundreds of hours of preparation, his law school aptitude test results, a key to admission, were but mediocre. He was particularly embarrassed by his poor showing on the grammar part of the exam. Every law school turned him down. He left the crisis clinic job in May of 1972 and was hired under a federal grant to work with psychiatric outpatients at Seattle's Harborview Hospital. He continued to keep his life with Liz carefully sequestered, allowing him to have a brief affair with Cynthia Holt, pseudonym, a fellow Harborview counselor. According to Holt, Ted was often cold and almost abusive with his cases that summer. He was more apt to lecture than to counsel. Bundy was further suspect by the hospital staff of calling patients at home at night, making anonymous threats, and talking inappropriately of sexual manners. Cynthia shared with Liz and Marjorie and a number of other women the unsettling memory that she was happily intimate with a serial killer. She told Hugh that the forearm Ted once shoved up against her throat as they were making love was no accident of overexuberance. Bundy could have killed her at that instant. But the most curious part of their affair, and the aspect the local police were most interested in, was the occasional long drives Ted would take her on through the hills behind Lake Sammamish, the area where many of his victims later were found. Ted, Holt said, was supposedly looking for an aunt or some old woman who was family. He said he was trying to find her a place. I'll never forget it because it was my car and my gas, and I was not exactly pleased to do this. I kept driving, and I kept saying to Ted, what does this place look like? At least tell me what the place looks like so I can help. There was never any description. We just drove around. Later, Ted's cousin John told police that he and Ted often hiked together in the same area. John reluctantly led Bob Keppel to the trails they used in and around the vicinity of Taylor Mountain. Ted felt a personal sense of futility at Harborview, he told us, a feeling of inadequacy and helplessness with his patients that more or less mirrored his personal life. He said he concluded that summer that the social sciences weren't capable of helping sick people. Psychology had failed him. To his joy and relief, however, 1972 was another election year. Bundy could take another vacation from himself. He looked up some old friends from the Fletcher campaign, and through them soon was busying himself as volunteer on the re-election campaign for GOP Governor Dan Evans. Vistas reopened. The young women who worked with Ted were captivated by his handsome features, fastidious dress, and correct manners. He flirted with them. Ted was unfailingly polite to his superiors and impressed some of the wizened veterans on the governor's staff with his dedication and ready grasp of hardball politics. Ralph Monroe, one of Evans's top operatives and later Washington Secretary of State, knew Ted slightly from the 1968 campaign. He was very friendly, very open, Monroe recalled. There were other people in the 1972 campaign that I probably knew better, but I remember him being there and being involved. I thought he was bright, sharp, he had good ideas. This was the Ted Bundy who'd be remembered to reporters, the absolutely normal young man with no hint of the flaw in his nature. Liz, however, was beginning to see glimpses of the real Ted, glimpses of the hunchback. He once threatened to break your fucking neck if she ever exposed him for the thief he was. She remembers that late one night he came by to retrieve a crowbar he had left under her radiator. Liz saw something bulging from his pocket and pulled it out. It was a surgical glove. Another night she woke to find Ted examining her body under the bedclothes with a flashlight. Later he tried to talk Liz into anal sex, which she refused in horror to consider. She did allow him to tie her up a few times before they made love. He used her pantyhose, which she noticed he found immediately in her bureau without needing directions. Still, he could be warm and caring. He could be her warm and caring Theodore, the idealized lover capable of great tenderness. During this period, Liz seems to have been much more concerned about losing Ted to his fancy Republican friends or another woman than she was about the danger signs. Later, they'd terrify her. After the 1972 election, Ted made a second successful attempt at law school admission. He prepared an elaborate new packet of materials to support his candidacy, including a letter from Governor Evans and a wordy denunciation of LSAT tests as inadequate measures of his true potential. The ploy worked. Ted was accepted by the University of Utah College of Law for the term beginning in the fall of 1973. Meanwhile, he went to work at the Seattle Crime Commission, where he stayed for just a month. He wrote articles for the commission's newsletter, attended its meetings, and aided with pilot studies of white-collar crime and rape prevention. One day, while he was out shopping with Liz, Ted spotted a purse snatcher and ran the man down. He held the suspect until the police arrived. Ted's heroics were duly noted by the Seattle Times, the first ever mention of Ted Bundy in the newspapers. With help from his political friends, Ted then found a job at the King County Office of Law and Justice Planning. His assignment was to study recidivism among those convicted of minor offenses in King County justice courts. He had access to nearly all pertinent arrest records, rap sheets, and the like. For weeks, he scoured thousands and thousands of arrests, noting with interest how poor the cooperation and coordination were among the various police and judicial jurisdictions. I don't remember this part either. Ted was amazed to find rap sheets showing arrests that had never resulted in a trial, but neglecting to list convictions for other crimes. There were habitual criminals with 2 or 3 dozen arrests shown, but he couldn't figure out from the records what happened to the people. They had just fallen between the cracks. This was a period akin to his campaign interludes. Ted's hopes and expectations were rising again after the disappointment of the previous summer at Harborview. In May of 1973, he went to work in Olympia for Ross Davis, the new head of the state GOP Central Committee. Earning what for Ted Bundy was the princely salary of $1,000 a month, he studied cost overruns in the party computer system for Davis and helped with several other research projects. Those around Ted at the time remembered that he looked up to Ross as if he were a big brother or favorite uncle. Ted loved to play with the Davises' 2 small children. Ross's wife, Sarah, recalled that Ted seemed to fit comfortably into their family that summer. He didn't talk much about himself, she said, but I didn't feel like he was trying to hide anything. He spoke of his mother and family in loving terms, end quote. That summer of 1973, Ted also saw a good deal of Marlon and Sheila Vortman, a law student and his wife who had been active in the 1972 Evans campaign. Like Ross Davis, Marlon was sturdy and purposeful, something of a big brother figure to Ted. Marlon also knew Ted to be a little quirky. One day he visited his younger friend and was surprised at the quality of Ted's possessions. They spoke of grander means than Marlon knew Ted to command. Odder still was Ted's explanation that he often came and went from a second-floor window by means of a ladder. He did so, he said, because he didn't want to disturb his fellow roomers. Marlon persuaded that he, like Vortman, should attend law school at the University of Puget Sound rather than go out of state for his legal training. The newly opened University of Puget Sound Law School, he argued, would put Ted in touch with local lawyers and would be a more suitable school for someone with local political ambitions. Ted agreed. He applied to UPS and was accepted into the night law school. Rather than admitting to the Utah people that he had changed his mind, Ted invented a story for them. He wouldn't be able to attend school in Salt Lake City that autumn, he wrote, because he had been injured in an automobile accident. Ted almost totally excluded Liz from this part of his life. The Davises didn't know she existed, and she was hostile toward Marlon, who she correctly guessed had more influence on Ted's decisions and actions than she did. At this time, she was also unaware that her boyfriend felt he had some unfinished business to attend to in California. In July of 1973, Ted flew to San Francisco to see Marjorie Russell. Although it was Liz who Ted claimed he loved, Marjorie had remained on his mind for years. He had kept in touch from her from time to time, but now he was ready to confront her again. Happy in his work and fairly bristling with confidence now that his legal education was about to begin, he felt an aura of personal magnetism shimmering about him. He felt that he looked different and acted different. He was different, at least in Marjorie's eyes. She later told the police that she found her erstwhile wishy-washy beau transformed into a man of action. He seemed to be in control now. Once again, Ted was acting out of fantasy. He had tailored his outward appearance to suit Marjorie's expectations and duped her into believing that he had changed. While he was in the role, Ted also believed he had changed. Back in Seattle, as the summer of 1973 drew to a close, Bundy wound up his work for Ross Davis. One afternoon, he drove his recently acquired 68 Volkswagen Bug over to the Davises' house for a visit. Outside in the driveway with Ross, he opened the car's trunk to rummage for something. There was plenty of junk to sort through. Ted Bundy was a pack rat. But as Ross cast an idle glance into the trunk, his eyes picked out a particularly unusual item in the jumble. There, resting in the clutter of tools and rags and other paraphernalia, was a pair of handcuffs. Unbeknownst to Liz, Marjorie, his family, and his friends, Ted was an immediate and thorough failure in law school. 8 years after he had first been enrolled as a freshman at the University of Puget Sound, Ted expected to return as a graduate student and to find clear-eyed and fastidious young men like himself. What he encountered on orientation day was a motley assortment of aspiring legal scholars who ranged in appearance from the well-groomed to the scruffy, and instead of his vision of an ivied citadel, Ted Bundy's idea of what a proper law school should look like, he found a small night school housed temporarily in an anonymous office building in downtown Tacoma. He was appalled. Ted was unbothered that he had to subsist that on unemployment checks, but the perceived taint of attending a quote-unquote second-rate law school was every bit as demeaning to him in his mid-20s as Johnny and Louise's boxy ramblers were to him as a child. Rigidly fixed on image and emotionally capable of having much perspective on his circumstances, Ted could not make the best of the situation. In no time, he was hopelessly behind the rest of the class, unable to grasp what his professors were trying to teach him. It was a repeat of his 1967 burnout in Chinese studies. The rest of the fall and winter of 1973 would be a period of unrelieved dolor for him. D-O-L-O-R. That means pain in Spanish, but I don't know what it means in English. By December of 1973, Ted had secretly reapplied to the University of Utah College of Law. He told no one of the decision until the following spring, and the new application to Utah made no mention of his current enrollment at the UPS Night Law School. Utah accepted Ted once again, but he would not be leaving for Salt Lake City until September of 1974. In the middle of his year at UPS, when the young girls began to disappear around the region, Ted kept up a convincing show of eager involvement with his studies. He attended classes faithfully until near the end of the spring term, and he applied himself to the material every few weeks when it was his turn to lead his study group discussion. He wasn't lying to Liz or his mom when he said that he spent much of his time in the law library. What he didn't tell them was that he spent most of his time there daydreaming, fantasizing. He was driven ever deeper into himself, into his cyclical and secret depressions. In his solitude, Ted devised complex rationales for the gaps between his wish to succeed and the reality of his failure, all the while guarding the secret of his inner turmoil from the people who thought they were close to him. He was very good at the deception, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed when the occasion demanded, but his tissue of deceits began to double back on him at Christmas time. Liz had flown to Utah to be with her family, while Marjorie, ignorant of Liz and almost everything else to do with Ted, came north for the holidays. For a week, she stayed with Ted in the Vortman's apartment while Marlon and Sheila were away on vacation in Hawaii. While the previous summer, Ted had even convinced himself that his life was back on course. Now he had to recreate the role of changed man from memory. He succeeded too well. Marjorie liked what she saw, and she wanted to talk marriage. They discussed it for days, Marjorie and Ernest and Ted, under mounting pressure, with the appearance of sincerity. He conned Marjorie again, just as he had repeatedly conned Liz. She flew home to California thinking that she was engaged to be married. Ted's well-practiced faculty for compartmentalization was at work again. He took Marjorie to the airport and kissed her goodbye. Then he sped in his Volkswagen over to see the other woman he insisted he loved. Ted found Liz in her kitchen with an apron on. The tableau was warm, domestic. He remembered that dinner aromas filled the air that night. Liz smiled up at him, and soon they were making love, the most passionate love they had ever made. A month later, as the futile search for Joyce and Jim Healy's daughter, Linda, was given periodic mention in the Seattle papers, Ted had his one final confrontation with Marjorie. She had occupied a segregated section of his mind for 7 years, an ideal woman whose heart he'd won, lost, recaptured, and now would break. Just as Ted could never fully explain to us his feelings for Liz, he also never understood his relationship with Marjorie. He hadn't exchanged a word with her since their Christmas betrothal. He had hoped by ignoring the situation to make it go away, but she telephoned him at his apartment on a Saturday evening. He had just returned from taking the law school aptitude test for yet another time, and was tugging into a 6-pack of beer when the phone rang. "Why the hell haven't you written or called?" He remembered Marjorie yelling. "What kind of way is this for you to treat me?" Partially anesthetized by the beer, Ted listened serenely to her tirade. He didn't apologize, he didn't explain, he just acted cool. "Don't ever bother to get in touch with me again," she told him. Well, Ted recalls replying, "Far out, you know." She hung up and he cracked open another beer. "I felt like the gods had spoken," he told me. "I felt doubly relieved. This meant it was all off my back." The rest of what we were able to establish about Ted's movements during these months comes principally from his own police records. January 31st, the night Linda Ann Healy was abducted from her basement bedroom, Ted attended his contracts class at UPS in Tacoma. He would have been back in Seattle in the early evening. Side note, I don't remember these notes being made this early in the book either. the specifics. March 12th, when Donna Gail Manson left her dorm room at Evergreen State College on her way to a jazz concert and was never seen again. Ted Bundy's dated law school notes indicate that he did not go to school. For the preceding months, these notes show a pattern of regular attendance, but they grow sketchy toward the end of March and stop altogether in early April. April 17th, the day Susan Rancourt left her dorm advisors meeting and vanished at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, a Volkswagen similar to Ted's was seen parked at Taylor Mountain, where Ted's second dumping ground was later discovered. May 6th, when Kathy Parks disappeared 260 miles south of Seattle in Corvallis, Oregon, Ted filled his Volkswagen's gas tank in Seattle and cashed 2 checks for a total of $20, sufficient money to cover the cost of a 500-mile round trip. During this period, Ted's gas credit card slips revealed that he did an extraordinary amount of driving, far more than would be expected of a money-short law student whose carpool responsibilities were restricted to a single 60-mile round trip from Seattle to Tacoma each week. And then moving on from there, he chose April to inform Liz that he had decided to transfer to Utah. Typically for Ted, he did so in a dramatic scene with tears and hand-wringing. He didn't tell Liz that he had arranged the move 4 months earlier. Ted was also going to need a summer job, so he drove down to Olympia and secured work at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. The DES was a catch-all agency. Its duties included coordinating local disaster relief and search and rescue teams. One of its functions was to help in the hunts for Linda Healy, Donna Manson, and Susan Rancourt. The search for Kathy Parks was Oregon's responsibility. Brenda Ball, Georgianne Hawkins, Denise Naslin, and Janice Ott were still alive at this juncture. But the emphasis at DES in the summer of 1974 was upon a different sort of emergency. The OPEC oil embargo had severely disrupted fuel supplies in Washington. At the time, there was no such thing as a federal or state energy department, and so it fell to DES to help bring order out of chaos by allocating the state's dwindling fuel resources. Ted's arrival at the office in May of 1974 caused a customary stir among the female employees. The males, too, found him charismatic. One who remembered Ted cutting a handsome figure that summer is Larry Diamond. Frankly, Diamond told me, he represented what it was that all young males anywhere ever wanted to be. He held that image. I wanted that image, and because of that, I was jealous of him. I think half the people in the office were jealous of him. The males and all the women were taken by him, down to the crease in his trousers. If there was any flaw in him, it was that he was almost too perfect. Bundy, who was assigned to work on the DES biennial budget, became something of a mentor to Diamond. He was more familiar than Larry with politics and politicians. He showed Larry how things got done within the state GOP administration, but Bundy didn't share too much of himself, even on subjects as universally popular among men as the curve of a particular woman's leg or her bust dimensions. He could have damn near any woman he wanted, Diamond recalled. Most men talk of women in the sense of fantasy. He didn't. It was almost like he compartmentalized them. Ted, Diamond continued, was almost one-dimensional if I think about it. It's like there's a very beautiful storefront that's attractive and lures you in, but when you get inside to see the merchandise, it is sparse, to say the least. A more faithful encounter for Ted that summer was with Carol Boone, later to become his wife and the mother of his child. Carol would one day remake her life for Ted. Her subsequent loyalty and devotion to his cause would beg a reason. In the summer of 1974, she was a lusty-tempered free spirit, regarded generally as the most competent staff member at DES. She was remembered by other DES employees as a sister/mother figure who did her work well, but who also was not above starting a rubber band fight or leading a circle of her closest co-workers on 3-hour liquid lunches in the Voodoo Room at the nearby Bailey Motor Inn. She had the wit and intelligence to do almost anything. At the time she met Ted Bundy, her personal life was in tatters. A favorite uncle had recently died. She was newly divorced from her second husband. She was trying to raise her son Jamie, and she was in the midst of a messy affair with quote, a large unpleasant man, end quote, as she later described him to me. I liked Ted immediately, she later recalled. We hit it off well. He struck me as being a rather shy person with a lot more going on under the surface than what was on the surface. He certainly was more dignified and restrained than the more certifiable types around the office. He would participate in the silliness partway, but remember he was a Republican. According to Carol, Ted made it clear he'd like to date her, but their relationship deepened, not into love at first, but into friendship and affection for each other. Part of the attraction was Ted's sensitivity to Carol's emotional problems. I guess I was closer to him than other people at the agency, she said. Carol noticed that from early June onward, Ted's health seemed to deteriorate. During 3 weeks in August, according to her, he lost 15 pounds. She attributed his poor health to the complex DES budget, which he had to finish before leaving for Utah in September. It hadn't helped that a cleaning woman had thrown out a cardboard box filled with Ted's budget files. She noticed, too, that Ted was receiving a number of acrimonious calls from Liz. She tried not to eavesdrop on them, just as Ted would politely walk away when she fought by phone with her lover. But Carol could see that the calls from Liz made Ted nervous and cranky. Ted and Liz had reached another crisis. According to Liz's book, she was waiting for some firm commitment from Ted before he left for Utah. She feared that their relationship would dissolve as Ted established himself in a new town and met new people, especially women. The previous autumn, she had discovered a bag of women's clothing in his apartment. At other times, she had noted the container of plaster Ted had taken from Pedline, as well as a pair of crutches. Liz had been too embarrassed to say anything. Then she observed a progressive ebb in his sexual ardor beginning in the spring of 1974. Now his erratic and sometimes bizarre behavior was beginning to frighten her. On Saturday, the 6th of July, the two of them went river rafting. Liz's book describes the day as peaceful and sunny. They drank a few beers and were drifting along quietly when Bundy suddenly lunged at her and shoved her into the water. She came up stunned and shouted her irritation at him. His unnerving response was not to respond at all. She was looking at a malefic stranger who didn't seem to recognize her. Finally, he said, "It was no big deal. Can't you take a joke?" Liz chose to bury the incident. The following Saturday, the day before Denise Naslund and Janice Ott were abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park, Liz telephoned Ted at Johnny and Louise's house in Tacoma. She wanted to know if Ted would be free to see her that day. "No, I can't," she remembers him saying. "I have other things to do." "What other things?" she pressed. "Just things, Liz," he answered. As she got ready for church the next morning, Ted arrived unexpectedly and asked Liz her plans for the day. According to her, Ted was eager to know where she was going. She named a small park where she hoped he might join her. He didn't. Late Sunday afternoon, about an hour after Denise Naslund disappeared, Liz returned home to a phone call from Ted. He asked her to have dinner with him and was at her door within 10 minutes. Ted said he was starving. They went to a bowling alley reputed to serve the best hamburgers in Seattle. The burgers were huge. Liz barely finished hers. Ted devoured two and then wanted to go for ice cream. She noticed he had a cold that had worsened since they had talked that morning. He looked tired too and was unusually quiet. In response to her questions, he said he'd spent the day cleaning his car and doing chores around the house. As Terry Storwick had noted years before, and as several witnesses would attest, Ted's eyes gave way much in times of stress. Now Liz saw it too. She recounted, "As I looked at him across the table, I was struck by how close together his eyes looked. They were a little puffy from his cold, but it was odd that I had never noticed it before." After dinner, they returned to her house, where Ted, in spite of his cold and tiredness, insisted upon taking her ski rack, which they had used to transport his bicycle on the rafting trip, from atop his car and putting it back on Liz's Volkswagen. Then he drove home. Ted's DES work records would later reveal that he missed the Thursday and Friday prior to Sunday the 14th, as well as the following Monday and Tuesday. He said he was out sick with the cold that Liz remembers. Ted Bundy was back at work at the DES office by the time the first composite sketches of the Lake Sammamish Ted were published. He took a good deal of kidding from Carol Boone, Larry Diamond, and the others. "Gee, Ted," they would say, "you sure look a lot like that guy, and you do own a Volkswagen." Mark Adams, Ted's former employer at the medical supply company, saw the composites too, and remarked to himself how alike they were to Bundy. Adams kept these impressions to himself. Someone else thought Ted Bundy looked like the composite. He was one of Liz's office friends. As she told the story, the man handed her the July 22nd Seattle Times, carrying the latest composite drawing. "Don't you think this looks like someone you know?" she recalled him asking. "Doesn't your Ted have a Volkswagen?" Liz tried to laugh, but she went home that night and compared her several snapshots of Ted with the newspaper picture. She noted several similarities, particularly in the jawline and around the eyes, but an equal number of discrepancies. Moreover, published reports indicated that the Lake Sam Ted drove a metallic brown Volkswagen Bug. Ted's was a dull light brown. Her fears, however, would not subside, a dilemma shared by thousands of women in and around Seattle. Panicked by the latest disclosures from Lake Sam, these women flooded the police with hysterical calls. Acquaintances, strangers, boyfriends, even husbands were being turned into the police at the rate of hundreds a day. In the overwhelming majority of cases, these women had far less substantive reason for fear than did Liz Kendall. At last, she decided to call the special TED hotline anonymously, but nothing conclusive came of it. After the papers reported that a man using crutches had solicited help with his briefcase at the university district, her thoughts flew to the crutches she had seen in Ted's room. She placed another anonymous call to the police, but wouldn't tell the officer her boyfriend's name. "I can't talk to you over the phone," the policeman said. "You need to come in and fill out a report." Liz hung up. As the summer wore on, Liz was torn between dread at what Ted might be capable of and apprehension over his coming departure for Utah. There continued to be unsettling experiences, such as the time she discovered a hatchet under the seat of his car, or the afternoon that she secretly searched his room and found an eyeglass case filled with a bewildering assortment of keys. Another time when she returned from a brief trip to Utah, Ted met her at the airport. "I felt as if I'd been hit in the stomach," she wrote. "All his curly hair was gone. It was the shortest haircut I'd ever seen on him, and it changed his appearance dramatically." Throughout August of 1974, Ted Bundy attacked the DES budget in the haphazard fashion so characteristic of his schoolwork. As his early September departure date approached, he'd bear down for several days, then go flat and do nothing. His last night in the Northwest was spent at the DES office with Liz, and it wasn't until the early hours of the next morning that he at last completed his work. Ted and Liz drove back up to Seattle, where he hurriedly packed his Volkswagen. They breakfasted together, and afterward he humored her when she asked him to pose for her camera. Ted was exhausted and Liz was near tears during these final moments. They embraced and kissed, and he jumped in his bug and drove off. Within days, L.Z. Hammonds, a grouse hunter, stumbled across the desiccated bones and sinews of Denise Naslund and Janice Ott. In a brief news conference, Nick Mackey of the King County Police officially acknowledged what the Seattle newspapers had been suggesting for months. "The worst we feared," Mackey told reporters, "is true."